okay with adding this language that that the ban on PFAS would be for, and whatever that may be, intentionally added PFAS.
Just to give Guardian's position, we are not okay with that. And then to the extent that Mr. Horwick could explain why intentionally added as a ban is different from a ban on PFAS without that language, I would let him do that. But I'm just saying that Guardian's position is that we do not support that language, quote, intentionally added, to be added to the proposed rule.
From my own perspective, I would be concerned about limiting the ban to intentionally added PFAS because there are, the largest source of fluid that goes into oil and gas wells is likely to be the water used in hydraulic fracturing. Wells can be injected with millions of gallons of water. An individual well can be injected with millions of gallons of water. And that water can come from surface water, groundwater, and it can come from water that is reused from previous hydraulic fracturing treatments. If any of those sources have very high levels of PFAS in them, and we know that those levels can be astronomical based on what we know about, for example, Cannon and Holloman Air Force bases here in New Mexico, then you could be injecting or introducing very high levels of PFAS into an oil and gas well, with the potential that that water could leak, spill. It could be in the wastewater that could come back to the surface. That could leak, that could spill. And so I think the commission should consider expanding the prohibition to at least to certain concentrations in the water used in hydraulic fracturing, because that's such a large volume of fluid used in oil and gas wells. The levels could be set at the same level that exists in like the EPA's drinking water regulation or other state drinking water regulations. You have to make sure the regulation could say you have to make sure your PFAS levels in your fracking water are at this level or lower.
Thank you, Mr. Horwick. No further questions.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Ampom, do you have questions of the witness?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much for taking time to be here today to present your testimony to the commission. I do have a couple of questions. So in your testimony, on page 2 of your testimony, there is a statement that I'll read. They are a class of laboratory-made chemicals that have useful properties, including being oil and gas, that have useful properties. So I just want to know, based on your studies, what are the, let's say, the usefulness of PFAS, as utilized in oil and gas industry? What is the importance of that?
I wish I could tell you, but there is a lot of confidentiality in the records that we looked at, and whether intentional confidentiality or not, it's very difficult to tell from Frac Focus what the PFAS are being used for in the oil and gas operations. There's a scientific paper that I cite in the report that I co-authored for Physicians for Social Responsibility, written by Gluge, G-L-U-G-E, and other authors, that surveys the use of PFAS across multiple industries. And in that article, they looked at patent records and other sources, and they found that PFAS had at least been proposed for use in oil and gas extraction for a variety of purposes, drilling, fracking, chemical flooding, but it's not clear if the PFAS was used for those purposes or where. So I can't tell you exactly how it's used in the industry.
So I want to ask, based on your studies, is there any specific example in the state of New Mexico in the two major basins, the San Juan Basin and then also in the Permian Basin, has there been any leak of PFAS into underground source of drinking water that has been documented?
You mean associated with oil and gas
Yes.
operations? Not that I know of. But I will add, there have been very few studies that we know of examining the link between PFAS use in oil and gas operations and water contamination. There are three that I know of that are more than just anecdotal. One was a peer-reviewed paper published about investigating private water wells in West Virginia. It came out, I believe, in 2023. The researchers looked at, I think, 45 private water wells, and they did find a number of those wells, 45 water wells in areas near oil and gas extraction. And they found that many of those wells had PFAS in them. And in three of those wells, they concluded that it was likely that the PFAS originated from oil and gas production. In the other wells, they could not be sure, because even though there was oil and gas production nearby, there was also another major source of PFAS pollution nearby, the DuPont and now Chemours chemical factory in Parkersburg, West Virginia. That's one study that did find a link between the use of PFAS in oil and gas wells and water pollution. And then there are two other studies, one by the U.S. Geological Survey, which studied, sorry, I have to remember which state they looked at. It was West Virginia. They looked at water supplies in West Virginia, and they did find PFAS in those supplies. Some of those water supplies were co-located in areas where oil and gas production is common, but they did not draw any conclusions about the sources of PFAS in those water supplies. And then the third study came out in 2023. The U.S. Geological Survey and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection looked at PFAS in streams in Pennsylvania, and they found PFAS in a number of the streams. And one of the findings was that some of the PFAS levels were associated with areas of oil and gas production and sewer system outfalls. But they said that more research was necessary to try to determine a link. Those are the three studies I'm aware of that have looked at some connection between PFAS use in oil and gas operations and groundwater, and I would say that more research is necessary.
Yeah. So, are you aware of how oil and gas well is built?
I have some familiarity with it.
Yeah. So, in your testimony, you talk about you found that oil and gas companies have used PFAS for fracking in New Mexico. You cited several wells that they've injected PFAS in there. And even you cited a company in your testimony. So I just want to know, if you look at how oil and gas wells are being constructed to about, let's say, 10,000 feet, and how the surface, the USDW, the lowest, or let's say the uppermost USDW, or the surface most USDW, the way the wells are being constructed to protect them, I'm still curious, because I don't see it anywhere here in terms of how, or let's say where it's documented, where operations in oil and gas wells in about, let's say, 10,000 feet all the way gets into the surface water. I'm curious, based on your research, these wells that you found in New Mexico, has there been any determinations that any of these injections more or less resulted in contamination?
Of water with PFAS?
Yes.
In New Mexico, I'm not aware of any. But I would refer again to the EPA's 2016 report on fracking and drinking water, as well as the evidence from New Mexico of groundwater contamination from oil and gas waste pits, which documented 400 cases of groundwater contamination. It's certainly possible that oil and gas operations can contaminate drinking water through a variety of different pathways. It doesn't necessarily have to come from the fracking that occurs 10,000 feet below the surface. There could be a spill of the wastewater that comes up after fracking is complete. There could be a spill on the surface before fracking is conducted or before drilling is conducted of chemicals. There could be in the drilling process, there could be chemicals used in drilling the well prior to fracking. And if the wellbore goes through the groundwater when those chemicals are being used, they could go directly into the groundwater. So there are multiple pathways. I think that more study is necessary to see if there is a link, because there has been very little study to date, and yet some concerning information. I just want to add quickly, when I said I'm not sure how PFAS has been used in the oil and gas industry, what I mean is we know that it's been used in fracking, but I can't say precisely how it's been used, whether it's been used for, a friction reducer or a biocide, or, I don't know that.
So in your testimony, you're saying that the petition that is the subject of this week's hearing asks the New Mexico Oil Conservation Commission to implement rules similar to the law enacted by Colorado and more or less California. So I just want to know, were those rules through legislation or through more or less like a rulemaking?
They were through legislation.
So then, do you believe that this probably should be the New Mexico legislature to more or less enact these hardline rules?
I have not researched that aspect in New Mexico law, but I would say that New Mexico should follow, particularly in Colorado's footsteps, one way or another. California's legislation is also a step forward. It covers fracking chemicals only, or stimulation chemicals only, whereas Colorado's legislation covers all chemicals used underground in oil and gas wells.
Yeah, so the MOGA position is that this has to be through legislation. So that is what I want to know, your position on that, whether it's appropriate, or not.
That's one aspect of New Mexico law I have not researched. I'm sorry.
So in your testimony, you also talk about full disclosure to public. Now, my question to you is, why not to the regulators, but to the general public with regards to the full disclosures?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again, please?
So my question is that with regards to the full disclosure and also even compounded with the trade secret provisions, why not there has to be a full disclosure of the chemicals used by the operators to, let's say, for example, NMOCD, for instance, and not necessarily to the general public?
You mean why not have the disclosure only to the commission and not to the public? Because the public has a right to know what chemicals they might be exposed to, so they can take action to protect themselves. For example, somebody might want to conduct what's called a baseline water test on their water well before any fracking occurs. And so if they knew that certain chemicals are being used in the oil and gas industry, and they know that a well is going to be drilled near them, then they can test for those particular chemicals. But under the current law, when there are so many gaps, whether trade secrecy provisions or the fact that New Mexico does not require disclosure of drilling chemicals or chemicals used for any purpose other than fracking, it's impossible for the public to know the full universe of chemicals being used in oil and gas wells, and they may not be able to conduct a baseline test on their water that would be comprehensive, that could test for those chemicals likely to be used, and then come back again after an oil and gas well were drilled or fracked and test again to see if there's any change in water quality, looking for those chemicals that they know have been used. It would also empower regulators and scientists to conduct similar testing, maybe across multiple drinking water wells.
So in your conclusion, on the last page, so that will be more or less a summary of your findings. You say that the findings in these studies that PFAS has contaminated water supplies near oil and gas extractions. So on that one, I'm sure you are referring to the case in Pennsylvania, West Virginia. Would you be very specific on that? Not necessarily making it more broad, to show probably more like this probably happened in New Mexico.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you just refer me to the exact page,
So
please?
page 19. And I presume that will be the summary of your testimony.
I'm sorry, which line on page 19?
Line number 5. As I read through your testimony, it's very broad.
Mhm.
So you are more or less making inferences from West Virginia, Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
and more or less that I don't see how you link that to New Mexico. So let's say on line number 5, the findings in these studies that PFAS had contaminated water supplies near oil and gas extraction. So on that one, I'm saying, can you more or less be very specific, to the examples that you are citing in here? Because this statement more or less looks very, very broad.
I can talk about the studies that I mentioned. I guess I would be repeating them. The study from West Virginia, which found PFAS contamination in 3 wells that the researchers did link to oil and gas operations nearby. And they found PFAS in multiple other water wells in the same study, and those wells were located near oil and gas operations, though they could not conclude that the contamination came from the oil and gas wells because of possible confounding sources. And then the other 2 studies, another one in West Virginia that looked at water supplies, one in Pennsylvania that looked at streams, that show an association between PFAS contamination and oil and gas operations. There just isn't a lot of data out there that specifically looks at that connection. But we know that where oil and gas operations have been conducted, including in New Mexico, there has been groundwater contamination of some type linked to those operations. In other words, oil and gas extraction can contaminate nearby water supplies. We know that from New Mexico, as well as from other states. And so if PFAS is being used in New Mexico, if it's being used elsewhere, there is a chance that the contamination associated with oil and gas wells could contain PFAS. So it's a risk.
Okay. So line number 11, and I just want to be very straightforward on this particular statement. We've talked about the trade secrets. Now you say that you present this in your testimony that oil and gas wells operators would have to disclose all individual chemicals injected into their wells without exception for trade secrets. They would have to disclose chemicals used in all stages and methods of extraction. So you want the commission to more or less agree to more or less enact this rule. Now, my question to you is that does this not violate the trade secret provisions?
You're talking about the Uniform Trade Secret Code that was mentioned earlier?
Yes.
I have not researched that aspect of New Mexico law.
Now, but you are saying it is your testimony.
Yes.
That the commission
Yeah.
should
I-
enact a law that
Yeah.
where all well operators would have to disclose.
Yeah.
So why would you, let's say, write a testimony like this
Yeah.
without more or less digging deeper into, let's say, whether we, the commission, do have authority to more or less enact this law, enact this rule?
It's my understanding is that you did, but I can take a look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ampoma. We need a break. It's been 2 hours and 15 minutes. So let's take a 15-minute break to 3:45. Oh, first, is there any reason not to excuse Mr. Horwath? Yes, no? Terrific. Thank you, Mr. Horwath.
Thank you.
You're excused. When we come back, I will issue a brief invitation in the event someone has been waiting on the platform to offer public comment, since we're between technical witnesses. Mr. Davis.
Quick announcement during the questions from the commission. I was able to put some page numbers and an exhibit number on Dr. Brown's rebuttal testimony. It's 2 pages. And my understanding is that he is on the platform. So again, contingent on a ruling that his rebuttal is offered for the purposes of rebuttal. It's there for everyone to see. I'm sorry, I don't have any hard copies, but I do believe we can call Dr. Brown next on the platform.
Terrific. Thank you very much for that. Let's take a break.
I'm going to the bathroom, so if the phone rings, you gotta do it.
Okay, nothing's gonna happen in the next 2 minutes, I don't think. No, I have a jacket.
I don't know that we have Mr. Tremaine, but I'll count on him coming back. Thank you, Mr. Rubin. Oh, thank you. Alrighty. We are back after an afternoon break. Let me ask first whether there's anyone in the room who would like to offer public comment. I see no hands. Is there anyone on the platform who has not already provided public comment, who has comment to offer at this time? There will be additional opportunities this week, but if you'd like to offer comment at this time, and I'm not referring to you, Dr. Brown, I'm going to take your testimony. I'm talking about non-technical public comment.
Okay.
Okay. Non-technical public comment. All right. I see no hands raised on the platform. So again, the next opportunity for non-technical public comment, excuse me, will be at 8:30 tomorrow morning. Please join us then if you'd like to offer something. And now we have Mr. Germain and Mr. Powell. That's terrific. Mr. Davis, would you call Dr. Brown, please?
Wild Earth Guardians calls Dr. David Brown.
All right, Dr. Brown, if you would join us, turn on your camera there. I believe you'll be pinned to our screen. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Mr. Davis.
Good afternoon, Dr. Brown. Could you please state your name and spell it for the record?
My name is David Robert Brown, and it's spelled D-A-V-I-D, Robert, R-O-B-E-T, and Brown, P-R-O-W-N.
Did you prepare direct testimony on behalf of Wild Earth Guardians in this matter? And is that Exhibit 57?
Yes. I'm having some trouble with my screen going off. Is it you or is it me?
We're seeing it. We're losing your image.
Don't think it's us, Dr.
It's
Brown.
more than likely on his end.
But you know what? If it makes your connection unstable, you can offer your testimony without the image. It's more important, at least for my purposes, to hear you.
Okay. It looks like it's okay now.
Okay, thank you.
I believe I left off asking you, Dr. Brown, if your direct testimony was Exhibit 57. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And did you prepare rebuttal testimony in this matter?
Yes, I did.
Is that Wild Earth Guardians Exhibit 97?
It is.
Do you have any changes to that written testimony?
No, I don't.
Did you review and rely on any documents to prepare your written testimony?
Yes.
Are those documents Wild Earth Guardians Exhibits 58 through 77?
Yes, they are.
Your CV is also an exhibit to your testimony?
Yes.
Is that Wild Earth Guardians Exhibit 56?
Yes, it is.
Is your written direct and written rebuttal testimony true and accurate to the best of your knowledge?
It is.
Do you adopt your written direct and written rebuttal testimony as your sworn testimony today?
I do.
Madam Hearing Officer, Wild Earth Guardians moves for admission of Wild Earth Guardians Exhibits 56 through 77 and Wild Earth Guardians Exhibit 97.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Are there objections?
No objections from NMOGA, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right, thank you. Hearing no objections. Exhibit
Quick
50.
one. Do we have the 97?
Yes, it was emailed recently. Mr. Davis?
My apologies. I actually was able to put an exhibit number and page numbers on that during Mr. Horwitz's examination, and I emailed that to hearing officer, parties, and to Ms. Apodaca, and I did not directly email anything to the commission.
Ms. Apodaca, would you email Mr. Davis's, forward Mr. Davis's email of Dr. Brown's rebuttal to the commissioners, please?
Yes, ma'am, I'll do it right now.
Thank you.
My apologies for that and not having a printed copy for the commission, but it is 2 pages, double spaced, I believe.
All right. I'm wondering, Sheila, if it is possible for another staff member to assist you in making a hard copy just for those of us on the dais up here.
Yes, I'll get that done.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Let me go back to the admission of the exhibits. I'm admitting exhibits 56 through 77 and 97. Let's see. We are going to go to Namoga first for questions. Is that you, Mr. Rankin?
Good afternoon, Madam Hearing Officer, commissioners, members of the commission. Yes, I'll be conducting the cross of Dr. Brown. Good afternoon, Dr. Brown. I'm sorry that your technology makes it hard for us to engage in a more personal way. But thank you for being here and thank you for your testimony. Dr. Brown, I understand from your dialogue with council that Exhibit 56, Wild Earth Guardians Exhibit 56 is your curriculum vitae. Is that right?
That should be right, yeah.
And that includes your education, work experience, and relevant training relevant to this hearing on this rulemaking?
Yes, it does.
And you would have included all relevant work and experience that would pertain to this specific rulemaking on that CV, correct?
I would.
But I don't see any in your relevant experience. I don't see any discussion of work with PFAS or PFAS related substances.
I've been on a commission in the state of Massachusetts, their expert panel, and we've discussed and gone into the detail of PFAS.
When did you join that commission?
Approximately 12, 15 years ago.
Okay. But you didn't, is that commission reflected on your CV or your work experience?
I'm not sure which CV I sent you. I might not have gotten on that one.
Well, let me see if I can just assist, not to belabor the point, but I want to make sure that we are able to reflect what I want to make sure I understand your history and background here. Are you able to see my page on your screen, Dr. Brown?
Do.
Okay. I'm going to just scroll through and if you would just tell me, do you recognize this as your CV, right?
Yeah, I think it was. Yes, it is.
Okay. Do you recognize the commission on this CV that you're referring to?
I may not have put it on that CV.
Okay. But you had some exposure to, let me change that phraseology, some experience working with PFAS on that commission. Is that right?
We did.
Okay. And what was the context of that commission? What was the name of the commission?
It was the Hazardous Substances Commission. It's Massachusetts Department of Health. And it was a group of experts who reviewed water and other issues that came before the toxicology group at the department.
What years were you on that commission?
I've been on it since it was founded.
Do you recall what years those were?
2019, 2018.
To the present?
Yeah, I'm sure that should have been 1918 to 1995 to present. Yeah.
Okay. So from 1995 to the present, you served on that commission on the Massachusetts Department of Health?
Right.
Okay. And in that commission, have you done research or prepared any reports or papers specifically addressing PFAS?
Yeah, we have. We've the state of Massachusetts department prepared papers. We reviewed them. This is a panel of experts from the New England area. We reviewed them and we issued directives on drinking water levels for Massachusetts. Those are required to be reviewed every 3 years. So we've done that twice, and our most recent review was 2023.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Brown. On your in your testimony, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down just because it's probably easier since I'm not sure if you have it in front of you. On page 9, if you do happen to have it in front of you, that's great. And if you don't, I'll try to direct you to the portion that I'm interested in here. Down on page 9 of your testimony, and I apologize if I'm making anybody dizzy by scrolling rapidly. I'm looking at page 9 in footnote 13.
Okay.
You state here that health risks associated with certain oil and gas fracking chemicals are shown in the document prepared by the Health Project, and you cite to Wild Earth Guardians Exhibit 68. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you agree with me that health risks, symptoms, or health effects, quote, associated with, end quote, a chemical exposure do not establish causation for purposes of public health toxicology. Do you agree?
Not exactly. If you have no information at all in a public health setting, you would look at exposure risks and look at the classes of chemicals and seeing if they are capable of producing the effects that you're seeing in the population. I think I'm not sure I understood your question about that.
I guess my question is, isn't there a distinction between something that determining causation versus associating an exposure with a certain health effect? Isn't there a distinction between confirming that something is caused by an exposure versus associating a health effect with it?
Well, certainly there is. It's a little more complicated than that. You have to think about what are the chemicals that you're looking at capable of doing. And in a public health situation, when you have a population that's showing health effects, you have to think about how to, whether those health effects could be related to that chemical. If you're doing a analytical research study, you would, or an epidemiology study, you would actually spend more time looking at chemicals and risks. These chemicals fell in classes that produce those kind of actions, and many of them actually, there is data available showing that they are health risks of various sorts. And that data has been tabulated by OSHA and other people, so you can get some feeling for them.
So if I were, in other words, you're saying that if I understand you correctly, that public health agencies have tabulated the data and have evaluated whether there's an association with a exposure for a certain health risk?
There's a, use the term exposure. There's an exposure level at which that health risk would be expected, yes.
Okay. But there's a difference between a health risk and an association with a health effect and determining causation with that exposure. Agree?
I don't.
Why not?
I don't agree, because I think your question was, is there association between, is there a difference between saying this chemical, this health action was caused by a specific chemical, as opposed to the fact that this chemical is present and we're seeing health actions which could be caused by this chemical or possibly another one. Generally, we don't have in environmental exposures single chemicals, we have mixtures of chemicals present.
So based on that exposure or mixture of chemicals, how do you determine causation to any one specific chemical?
You identified this as a plausible health link, and since you're in a public health setting, you act to remove that chemical that plausibly could be producing the effect.
Now, also in your testimony, skipping down to page 15.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, it didn't take me a moment to get there.
That's okay.
I'm looking at lines 12 to 14. I'll highlight it here just for ease of reference. You state that, and I'll read it, and you tell me if I've done a good job. It also has been confirmed that exposure to PFAS can cause hepatotoxicity, neurotoxicity, reproductive toxicity, immune toxicity, thyroid disruption, cardiovascular toxicity in humans, and pulmonary toxicity and renal toxicity in laboratory animals. Did I read that correctly?
That's correct.
And then you cite here to a paper that is attached to one of your exhibits. Is one of your exhibits. It's Exhibit 73-A.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to read the whole title of that exhibit, but that's the basis that you rely on for that statement, correct?
Well, not the entire basis, but that and the fact that you see those links are links that are in the literature. I read the original papers on it, and they show that there is hepatotoxicity effects, and there are other effects at very low doses.
So I just want to work through the nuance or the language here, because I think it is important. Here in your testimony, you use the word confirmed.
That's right.
And then you also use the word cause. And I want to understand whether that's paper that you cite to, because I read through it and I'm not aware, I can't determine, I don't see where in that paper it establishes or confirms that any of those conditions are caused by PFAS. Do you agree with me that paper does not establish causation?
No, I think given the current level of understanding of PFAS I actually looked at the basic actions of PFAS. PFAS is very, very toxic. It's at low concentrations. It tends to bind with receptors, and it tends to interfere with membranes. It also has effects on endocrine factors. There's no doubt that it does that. It does that in animals. And in people, there's similar reports of similar effects. Cause may be too strong a word, but if you want to put plausibly cause in front of that, you can do that. But it is a plausible cause of these effects. In fact, the problem with PFAS is we don't know exactly how it acts in the receptor system to make these changes happen in the body that people are experiencing. But it's confirmed that that's what's happening. There's multiple studies, not multiple, but at least 5 to 10 that show that those effects are occurring. Question is, what dose do they occur at?
Okay, just a couple of questions. I mean, I think I understood you to say, I mean, are you changing your testimony that it maybe should be restated as plausible cause?
No, I'm convinced that that's within the sense of, as well as we know the effects of those things, that those are they are linked to that, to those exposures. And I think the word cause is descriptive of what's going on for the general public.
Just to be clear, you're using two different terms. One is linked and also cause. And I want to understand, do you use those synonymously, linked and cause, to mean the same?
Depends on where I'm talking. It depends. And if I'm talking to a population, I would give this a strong response to that. If it was in front of the Society of Toxicology, I would give them more information about why I believe those relationships are causal.
Okay. But as to this citation on this paper here that I was referring to in footnote 24, is it your testimony that that paper that you cite to does establish causation for those health effects that you referenced in your testimony?
It was not entirely, but as a group of papers that we looked at, it was a key paper.
Okay. Now on page 8, I'm going to flip back again. I apologize for bouncing around. I wish I could say there was a reason to my madness, but I don't think there really is.
I'll try and help you out.
All right, page 8. I'm looking at lines 2 to 6. This is sort of jumping into a discussion where I think there was some public health assessments going on in Pennsylvania. Do I have that sort of general description correct for this portion of your testimony?
Would you say your description again?
That starting at, it's really at the bottom of page 7 at line 22, this portion of your testimony is discussing a public health assessment that was occurring in Pennsylvania. Is that correct?
Yes, it was a situation where people who were exposed to fracking and exposed to gas development were experiencing health effects and other concerns. And we were asked to, I was asked to come in and form a group to see what was happening. So it was the beginning of a public health investigation of the type that we would have done if we were at HSDR or someplace else, and they wanted to do the investigation. That is a description of the beginning of that project.
Okay. Now, on that topic, reading through your testimony, your experience here, as I understand, is intended to relate your experience in Pennsylvania, correct?
Well, it does relate my experience in Pennsylvania. But it was attempting to emphasize the fact of what problems occur if you're trying to investigate a public health outbreak where people are sick and you don't have information on what they're being exposed to, and you don't have information on the capability of the community where they're living. So our objective was to try to do something to ameliorate their health issues.
And so in your testimony, it's limited to your experiences with oil and gas operations in Pennsylvania?
This was done in Pennsylvania, but we also looked at other states.
In your
we
testimony,
formed an organization. There's an organization formed. It was called the It's now called the Environmental Health Project. It was called the Southwest Environmental Health Project. The initial studies were done in Southwest Pennsylvania, extended further out from that in ultimately we're working areas nationwide.
Okay. But in your testimony, though, Dr. Brown, I didn't see anything outside of Pennsylvania. Do you agree with me that your testimony was limited to your experiences with oil and gas operations and public health effects in Pennsylvania?
Well, included my entire experience, but most of the data that I showed you came from Pennsylvania, yes,
Okay.
and came from that project.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Brown. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rankin. Mr. Maxwell, do you have any questions of Dr. Brown?
Your Honor, I have no question.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Tremaine.
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, I do have a few questions. Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Brown. Thank you for being here and thank you for your time. I just have a few clarifying questions. In Wildlife Guardians exhibit 57 on page 13, you included a table including a list of symptoms. Do you recall that?
Page 13, yeah, I did.
Okay. Is my understanding correct that this is a list of symptoms that were reported to Health Project staff by individuals in the community?
You're correct, but they were, the way we set this up, we would send a nurse practitioner or a nurse or a health professional to each one of those people. Mm-hmm. They were families. We selected one person out of each family, usually the adult. And these questions there was a questionnaire, I didn't give it to you, but a questionnaire that asked, typically as a clinician would look at a case, starting from the head on down, each system identified, we asked a question about that system. For example, do you have any problems with dizziness, or do you have any problems with that? And the people would say, well, I may be woozy or I may be something else, but because we had professionals asking them, they would say, well, that's dizziness or that's nausea, or we would rate that as that. So each one of these items was defined as a clinician would define them, who was looking at the people. We did that both in Pennsylvania, near the fracking areas. Many of these people were there. We also did it in New York State, which was similar, but no fracking or nothing had happened to these people, but they were identified as places where fracking would occur, or a compressor station or something would occur.
Okay.
So it just isn't a questionnaire where somebody wrote something down. It was identified by a clinician.
And is my understanding correct that the purpose of this table is to indicate your findings or conclusions that individuals reporting to Health Project that were within a certain proximity to gas development experienced this list of symptoms at a higher rate than individuals who did not live within that proximity?
Yeah, what we were trying to do is to identify which symptoms we had appeared to be most likely to be most reasonably to be related to the health area. For example, if you go down and look at joint pain, which is about the 12th from the bottom, this table suggested that's unlikely to be related to the health problem. But if you go up and look at nausea, for example, or abdominal pain, that was more likely to be related to the health problem. What we were really trying to do was to create an epidemiologic case description so we could take the next step. And this told us what we should be looking for to designate this as a case.
Okay.
For effects. So it's more than that. And there is some statistical significance within it, but we didn't test the statistical significance of this because it was not a research study. It was trying to direct our project.
So, Dr. Brown, when you in this analysis, when you're looking at individuals or getting reports from individuals who are living in proximity to gas development, can you please clarify what is the radius of that proximity that you're looking at?
Yes, I can. It's usually within 2 miles or about 3 kilometers. Is we restricted our looking at where we were calling it cases. We thought we had cases further out, but we wanted to be certain that we were not getting something else.
So is it your testimony that after performing this analysis, you associate a certain list of health symptoms to living in proximity to gas development in Pennsylvania?
It's my analysis that we see an increase in those symptoms because, for example, you get a headache for some other reason, but this population, which is a pretty large group, that's 72 people, that was a real increase.
Is my understanding correct that at the time of performing this analysis, you were not aware of the potential of PFAS as a contributing factor to these potential health impacts?
At that point in time, we had no idea that PFAS had any involvement whatsoever with oil and gas, and that was and other compounds also, and that was a major problem from a public health standpoint because what we were trying to do is identify where the likely causes are coming from, using causes again for your earlier gentleman. And in public health, when you're at that stage and you don't know what is happening, you take a step to break the chain of transmission. You're not trying to prove anything about this chemical does something or doesn't do it. You're trying to protect as many people as you can, as quickly as you can.
Dr. Brown, I took as a core tenet or takeaway from your testimony that one of your primary concerns was that you, due to a lack of information, you do not actually know what might be causing potential symptoms, such as those listed in this chart on page 13. Is that fair?
It's fair up to a point. We know that some of those chemicals that were there were capable of causing that, and it seemed reasonable to conclude that. But we also knew there were other chemicals there which could have been synergizing and increasing the responses to these chemicals. It's those other chemicals that we didn't know. So we were having to make the best judgment we could to protect the people with the information that was available. When we didn't have information available, we had no way to do anything with it because we didn't have any information. Is that clear?
I think it was. Thank you, Dr. Brown. The wells that in this analysis, when you're talking about these wells in Pennsylvania, for which reporting individuals are living within that 2 mile radius or certain proximity, are you aware of the producing depth of those wells?
That information is available in Pennsylvania. It's on Pennsylvania DEP provides that data. So on any given well at any given time, you can go and look at the depth of the well and see whether it's a shallow well or a frightened well. We looked only at hydrofracking wells.
Okay. Can you characterize the average depth of the wells that were considered? No. Okay. Would you agree that gas development in Pennsylvania typically occurs at a shallower depth than that occurring in New Mexico?
I don't know.
Are you able to characterize the difference between the production depth of these wells and the water depth?
Most of the wells were going through the water table. And then the fracking was occurring below the wells. If that's your question.
Yes, Dr. Brown, that's essentially my question. I'm trying to get at how far, what's the delta in depth between the fracking depth that you're looking at and the water table?
It was, I don't, I can get that actually data for you if you want them. It's surprised somebody knows that. I mean, but the fact is that the flowback water that was coming back and the produced water that was coming back was getting sometimes, and the flaring was reaching the homes and people who we were working with.
Thank you. Dr. Brown, I think I just want to clarify, did you draw any conclusions as to whether the potential health systems you note in your testimony and in your project were associated with air impacts or exposure to water contaminants?
Yes.
Could you articulate that distinction?
Sure. If we took the evidence that we had, we looked at people who were drinking groundwater wells and were also getting exposed by the air, and compared them to people who were drinking public, what we called public water that was from a community or such, and compared the two. And we would see in both cases, we saw the pattern of health effects we were seeing. But we saw that those patterns were higher in those people who were drinking groundwater.
Thank you for that, Dr. Brown. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tremaine. Mr. Davis, any follow-up?
I do not.
Okay, let me move to the commissioners then. Commissioner Ampoma, would you like to start this time? Sorry, Commissioner Bloom. That's what I meant to say.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Brown. Can you hear me
You're
okay?
welcome. Great. I can hear you fine. Thank you.
All right. From my perspective at this point, some of the issues we have to resolve during the course of this hearing are what definition of PFAS do we use? Should we prohibit the use of undisclosed chemicals in New Mexico? We also need to talk about how studies are performed post accident in our state, and should notification be changed, and if so, how do we do that? So I think my questions for you are, do you have any thoughts on which definition of PFAS we should use? There's a broader one that Wild Earth Guardians has proposed, and I believe OCD and NMOGA have a different definition or definitions. I think I'll make that the question. So any thoughts on which definition we should use, the broader or more narrow one?
I would use the broader definition. And the reason is that if we look at PFAS, first of all, PFAS is amazingly toxic. It is probably more toxic than dioxane. The water levels set by EPA for all of these agents are very low. They're in parts per trillion. Of the compounds that we've studied well, that have been studied well, I think only one or two have been shown not to be as toxic as the extremely toxic ones, although they're still toxic. So every compound that has been tested carefully has been shown to be a very hazardous compound. I think if other chemicals come in, we would be acting too hopefully that they would not be a toxic chemical. I think I think it's 7 out of 9 chemicals are in the highly toxic range. I think there's a message for us there.
And this is, you're thinking on this based as a doctor of physiology and toxicology?
Yeah, more on my chemistry and my biology background. We think about compounds in toxicology in groups. We think about aldehydes, we think about groups of chemicals, and we think about what target organ do they have. We don't have a specific target organ necessarily for these compounds, but wherever they turn up, they seem to produce effects at very, very low doses. There's a piece of data from Minnesota that I didn't provide to you, where the state of Minnesota put strong controls on PFAS, and the blood levels in their people actually went down after a couple of years. So I think that there's no doubt that they get in the body, they produce blood levels that are within the range that we would be worried about as health professionals, and not having them there is better. And to come back to your question, I think we would be making I want to use the term faulty, but if we were to assume that these compounds only occurred, the ones we've found all the toxic ones, and the others are not toxic, I don't think that that's a logical assumption.
And Dr. Brown, do you feel comfortable talking about public health?
Yes, I do.
Okay. I think one of the reasons there's a more broad and a more narrow proposal is the more narrow one would limit what we can test for, saying that there aren't tests for all of these substances out there, therefore we shouldn't ban them. Any comments on that?
I'll try to keep myself under control. Not knowing whether something is toxic doesn't make it safe to anyone. And we have a history in our country, in the world, of finding toxic chemicals that we've been breathing for years. Lead would be one of them, and others, mercury and things of that sort. When we got the chemicals out of the environment, people showed increased robustness and stuff. So from a public health standpoint, if you don't know that something is safe, the only thing you can say is, I don't know whether it's safe or not. And if somebody asks you what to do, you need to avoid the exposure or reduce it if you can. The problem with PFAS in this danger is individuals don't have a way to reduce it. They can move away is all they could do. And people in Pennsylvania, some of them just abandoned their homes and moved away because they couldn't be certain their children were safe. I don't think we personally, as a toxicologist or a professional or anybody, I don't want people moving away from their houses because they don't know whether it's safe or not.
So in your professional opinion, you would say that we should establish a chemical is safe before we allow it versus allowing it and then trying to find out later if it's toxic?
That would be the only moral thing to do, but we don't do that. We don't have a precautionary principle. But we do. FDA, for example, with drugs, carefully follows exposures in people when something new is put out there, so that each year they would go back and make sure the drug didn't have some unforeseen effect. occupational medicine, we usually could do that by, and I worked in occupational medicine for some time. We actually can look at the workers and see how the workers are doing after the exposures. With the oil and gas industry, there really is no available that I know of health information on their workforce available to the public. So you don't have that clue. You have to go to the public, as we had to go in Pennsylvania and say, first, were these people plausibly exposed? They were. Were they showing health effects? They were. Were there chemicals there that could have caused these health effects? They were there. Did we know what to tell them to do? We
Thank
didn't.
you. Yeah, thank you. Just changing tack, maybe two more questions.
Yeah.
So Wild Earth Guardian's proposal would greatly expand disclosure to residents, police departments, fire departments, the Bureau of Land Management, the state land office where I work, anyone within 1 mile of where the frack job's taking place. We're not quite sure yet what form that communication would take. It could be a postcard, it could be a certified piece of mail. What would you want? I looked at some of the citations you made. You talked about the EPA's SALT program, or I'll call it SALT program, and it talks about providing, I think, kind of actionable information, following up so that there's education, things like that. Just your thoughts, please.
I'll try to stay on point. First, if you don't tell somebody that something's toxic or something is there and you know it, and they find out that you didn't tell it to them, you cease becoming a trusted source. SALT talked about trusted sources. And once you cease to becoming a public trusted source, the public health community and the government overall loses its ability to protect the population because they just don't believe you. They think you lie. So you don't want to do that. Water companies in some areas have systematic ways where they warn you. I just got something on the mail from my water company saying they didn't know whether there was toxic lead in the pipe coming to my house or not. I should test it myself. That's so, but they have frequent requirements that they do that. Some communities have put data on websites so that you can get to websites. The Frac Focus website is a nice website, but it doesn't tell you enough. It tells you that there's a chemical there. It doesn't tell you what sort of organ system would be affected, which a clinician would need. It doesn't tell you what the signs and symptoms would be, which is what a patient would want. Can that problem be solved? I think it can. I think that we have to change. In some cases, we might do it at the county level. If you have counties, you might do it at the Department of Public Health level. If you have an aggressive public health department or a thoughtful public health department. But I think the failure to tell somebody that something is there, you lose so much of your ability to do your job when they decide, I can't trust those people. I think you have to do something.
Thank you. No further questions. Thank you, Dr. Brown.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chair, do you have questions?
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Appreciate it. I do have some questions on the chart that you have on page 13 with the symptoms in the exposed population from Pennsylvania and the non-exposed population in New York. Just out of curiosity, why is your sample size different, an N of 77 and an N of 88?
It is different. It wasn't a study. This was a collection. We
Dr.
got
Brown, your volume kind of went down. You changed something with your microphone. I could barely hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. It wasn't exactly a study. We were looking in New York State for health effects that were occurring. We managed to get 88 families. We looked at Pennsylvania, and we were remember if I was restricting the families to a certain distance around the site, and that's the number we got. Statistically, I've got a doctorate, not a doctorate in statistics, but I studied statistics at Berkeley and Harvard, and those numbers we could do statistics with if we wanted.
So thank you for that. But I do have a question. Then on page 7 of your testimony, you spoke about the table on page 9 shows a comparison of health complaints between fracking communities in Pennsylvania and similar population in New York. Is this the same table, just different wrong page number?
Yeah, it's the same table. It got moved around when I was doing it. And the reason I stated it that way is we didn't go to Manhattan and look at people.
Sure.
We went to rural New York, which was kind of like rural Pennsylvania with different food.
So thank you for that. But for rural New York, did you apply the same criteria? You said that the area in New York was planned to have gas wells, but drilling had not happened yet. So did you still follow like they would be within 2 miles of these proposed gas wells, et cetera, et cetera?
That's a very good question.
I can't hear you again, Dr. Brown. You changed something?
I know what's happening. Okay. That's a very good question. I think we may have made the distance a little bit bigger just because there wasn't anything going on. There would be a farmhouse, and this would be the farmhouse within a mile or so, or half a mile of where they were projecting they were going to put the well, or in some cases it was a compressor station.
Okay, so we're not really dealing with apples and oranges with oranges. We're fruit, but not the same statistics. So when you state we could draw statistical comparisons off of this, we really can't, because you're really not dealing with the same data set.
And we didn't.
Or criteria.
Yeah, we didn't. What we were doing was looking at people who had the same SRS background in New York and comparing them to similar people in Pennsylvania. And we were trying to identify which of those health effects we were seeing would be more likely than not to be associated with the being near the wells.
Okay, and just to clarify, the criteria, such as being 2 miles within a 2 mile radius of a well or a proposed well, was not applied, correct?
Well, it was in Pennsylvania.
In Pennsylvania, but not in New York.
There was no well in New York.
I know, but there was a proposed site, correct?
Yeah, we did not do that, no.
Okay. Thank you for that. My next question was in the questioning that the Oil Conservation Division asked you. You stated that chemicals can synergize.
Sorry.
I beg your pardon?
I'm sorry.
It's been a long day, I know, Doctor. I apologize. It's long for us as well.
And it's beyond 7 in New York.
Yes, I know. So if you could just bear with me, I apologize.
Yeah.
You stated that these chemicals can synergize, and I wanted to know, synergizing in what way? Do we have any of that data?
Yeah, we do a little bit. Synergism,
Okay.
Particularly these chemicals tend to attach themselves to fine particulate and PM 2.5. And the PM 2.5 carries the chemical into the deep lung.
And Doctor, I'm sorry, could you tell me what PM 2.5, because that was going to be one of my questions as well. I was trying to find it in your testimony here, but you didn't say what PM stood for.
I'm sorry. It's particulate matter. It's soot that is put
Okay.
out smoke, but very fine smoke, less than the width of a human hair.
2.5 microns, 2.5 nanometers.
No, 2.5 microns.
Okay, thank you.
Very fine particulate. And that size particulate adsorbs water-soluble chemicals to the surface. Those water-soluble chemicals, if they're not on particulate, are trapped in the upper respiratory tract and are relatively non-toxic. If they're on particulate, they go by that trap and go to the deep lung where they can be absorbed into the bloodstream. So that that effect is about a 10-fold effect in terms of toxicity. So if you put a toxic chemical in the air and expose some animal to it, and then put fine particulate with it, mix it, and then it will make the animal 10 times as sensitive.
Okay.
And unfortunately, almost all of the chemicals that we're getting around these sites are in the presence of fine particulate, PM 2.5 and smaller.
Okay, that made more sense. Thank you for clarifying that. But I just have two more questions, and they should be fairly simple.
Sure.
In the table with the Southwest Pennsylvania and all the symptoms that they were seeing, was blood work done on these individuals? And if so, was PFAS in these people's blood?
There was, in some cases, there was blood work done that was gathered from NIOSH, National Institute of Occupational Health data. Some cases there was blood work done on those chemicals. In other cases, it was just an air. It was not just an air exposure; it was another effect. And I don't think they looked for PFAS.
Okay, but there was some PFAS data collected on some of the samples.
For that table, we didn't know PFAS was a problem when we prepared that table, so we didn't look for it.
Okay. Sorry, that generated another question for me then. So then you're extrapolating that PFAS is present in the area. PFAS can have these particular effects on an individual. Hence, PFAS could be attributing cause to, for instance, as you brought out, and I apologize, I flipped the page, so I need to get back. Headaches, shortness of breath, hair loss, skin cysts, any of these gamut of issues. Is that what I'm understanding? You're extrapolating that PFAS could potentially cause these issues.
Well, some of them they could. Some of them are consistent with what PFAS is known to do. Others it's not. But there are certain ones in here if you'll bear with me, I can take a look and see if I can show those. Shortness of breath maybe, although the skin rash, the weakness, and there's probably others in there too, are also consistent with PFAS being there. But there's other chemicals that could do that too in the chemicals that we found present in fracking.
Okay. So it could be any gamut of these chemicals that are in fracking, including PFAS, could cause these issues, correct?
Sure.
Okay. So you're not necessarily saying PFAS is doing this. You're saying any gamut of these compounds could be contributing to these causes in these individuals.
Yeah. The big problem is that nobody's getting exposed to just PFAS or just nitrogen oxide. People there are getting exposed to all of it. And when they get exposed to it because of the weather system, they get exposed to very high levels. But you're faced with, I don't know.
Okay. And as you can see, I mean, I understand that there's other chemicals as well, but we're strictly talking about PFAS. So I'm keeping it strictly on the PFAS here. So I do
Okay.
appreciate your answers on that. My last question for you, in your conclusion on page 20, starting with line 5, it says, additionally, it requires a community notification of chemicals used downhole in oil and gas operations. And you were stating how in this particular paragraph that undisclosed chemicals down the hole in New Mexico right now is a problem. Did Pennsylvania notify individuals of downhole chemicals?
No, that was part of the problem. They eventually began to put they strengthened their identification. This project went over 9 years, and it's still going on. But at the beginning, the people didn't receive any information at all. Ultimately, they did. There was a Attorney General's report, which I think you might want to look at, that caused the Public Health Department to become more aggressive.
Okay, awesome. So then in your professional opinion, who should be notifying these individuals? Would it be the actual company that is using PFAS? Is it a Department of Health? Is it in this instance like the Oil Conservation Division who regulates in the state of New Mexico? Who would be issuing these notifications?
I would think the group that is most trusted in this is the Department of Health.
Okay.
That's who I would think should do it. The least trusted, my apologies to people are the companies.
Sure.
Now, there were companies in Pennsylvania who we had a great deal of confidence in, who came to us with information and were interested in what we were finding and what they could do about it. So it isn't a blanket, every company is bad. None of them were bad, but some companies were very, very concerned about the health issues that they might be creating.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Brown. No further questions for me.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Mpoma.
Thank you. Dr. Brown, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
So I do have a couple of questions on page 4, line 5. In your testimony, you said that while the guardians has asked that I describe our early experiences responding to the human health risks from those chemical exposures encountered by residents in communities near oil and gas extraction. So my question to you is that as you were preparing for your testimony, did you gather any data from the state of New Mexico, especially within the 2 basins that produces oil and gas in the state?
I didn't use any data from New Mexico in doing that. In our history, we had worked with the Navajo Nation and on issues that they had with gas extraction. And of course, I considered that. There's a report on that someplace. But I didn't include it as it wasn't central to any point that I was making.
So based on your studies, more or less centered in Pennsylvania, so why do you believe that the state of Pennsylvania has not banned PFAS?
I really don't have any professional knowledge on what the state of Pennsylvania does or doesn't.
Can you provide to the commission, the depth, based on your study, the depth where oil and gas operations were occurring in your study area, specifically in Pennsylvania?
I could do that. It would require that I go back and dig it out. It would be a significant effort.
Yeah, I think certainly that can be provided to us since we do have a couple of days within the hearing. Definitely, it is good for the commission to more or less, since there has not been any specific study in the state of New Mexico, and we are more or less relying on other states. I think it is fair to the commission for us to get all the information for us to more or less make a very good decisive decision on this matter.
Yeah, I think I suspect one of the people that I was talking to earlier can go online and get that depth information for Washington County in Pennsylvania.
So in your study, as you prepare for your testimony, so is your testimony that you don't have any data or you do not have any information with regards to exposure of PFAS to the oil and gas operations in the state of New Mexico?
I don't.
Okay. You talk about the pathways of exposure on page 10 of your testimony. I want to ask you, are you familiar with oil and gas operations, especially how we drill a well, we stimulate a well, we complete a well?
I'm not expert in that area, but in the work we were doing, we had to understand how the wells were being drilled, the number of wells would be on a site, and how they displayed what the air exposures were around the wells and what the potential water pathways were.
So with that, then can you explain to me, it's not really clear on the pathways of exposure. I do know that you've mentioned water contamination and airborne exposure. So based on your understanding as to how oil and gas wells are operated, can you more or less explain to the commission how, based on your study, you've seen water contamination through let's say with PFAS, and then also airborne exposures for us to fully understand with regards to the pathways of exposure?
I think you asked for PFAS. We didn't know PFAS was there, so we didn't look for PFAS. We know other chemicals were there, and I can explain how we determined that there was we would call that an open pathway of exposure through water or through air. I could explain that to you.
So you're saying that even now, because you still made mention of the PFAS in that session of your testimony.
Mm-hmm.
So can you describe to the commission how you see a contamination of, let's say, USDW, underground source of drinking water, by, let's say, PFAS, and then also the airborne exposure as well?
Well, they're both pretty easy. If PFAS, everything that goes down the well that isn't utilized in the fracking process eventually comes up the well with the gas. And it's released in, I don't want to go into a lot of detail on that. Sometimes it's just released into the air in a blowdown. Sometimes it's released to the air in the gas as the gas is dried. We had wet gas in Pennsylvania. The gas goes through a drying process and chemicals are released into the air that way. Sometimes the water comes back and the wastewater and the produced water is used for various uses. At one point in Pennsylvania, they were using it on the highway to control dust. So all of those were ways that information could get from the well to a person who could breathe it and be affected by it. That would be we would call that an open pathway. What we were trying to do, or our goal, was to close as many pathways as we could. We could close water pathways by simply saying, don't drink water, drink it out of bottled water instead. We close that pathway partly by saying don't take showers in any shower that isn't well ventilated. We could say take short, cold showers, which didn't go over big with the teenage kids. But our goal was to reduce the exposure because we did not know exactly what was causing people to be sick. But we knew that they were ill, and we knew that those people who were more ill were near sites with open pathways of exposure.
Dr. Brown, so on page 12 to page 13, you talk about a table of health symptoms. Now, can you explain to the commission how we should utilize this table? Especially where there is no data from the state of New Mexico. You are presenting two different, let's say, scenarios, and even the chair probed a little bit more, to compare even if it is apples to apples. How would you want the commission to view this table? And also, how would you want us to incorporate that into our decision making?
I can only go so far with that. The way you would use a table like this is really 3 steps. First, you would look at these are symptoms, and you would say what organ system, the brain, the lungs, or so ever, are affected by these systems. We did that in our process. We would then take that data and create what we called a case description. And the case description is actually in our files. It's online. It says if you have 1 or more of these symptoms, or 3 or more of these symptoms, and you are in a position where you could be in a pathway of exposure, then we should consider your effect as a potential associated with the well or with the fracking process. That table is as complete as we could make it when we made it. But once you have a case description, then a public health agency or anyone else can screen a population and find out who is being affected and who's not being affected. There's another step, of course, of identifying where are the possible sources of exposure to these people. If I were doing this, I would ask the health department. I've done this, actually. I would say to the health department, if people call you with this series of effects and they are in an area where there's gas drilling, you should be concerned about a contaminated well or a downwind exposure that they're getting that's unduly high. The health department then is going to have to decide what it wants to do to protect those people.
Thank you.
It can be done. I will assure you that it can be done, but somebody with public health background or health background is going to need to think through the steps for New Mexico, because I'm not from New Mexico. I'm from Connecticut. We have an ocean right next to us, and you guys are high desert, so it's different.
Yeah, so even on that point, would you agree with me that it would have been more effective if more or less, being an expert, you might want to more or less contact someone in New Mexico who really do understand what is going on in New Mexico to give you some guidance on your testimony?
No, I don't think I need guidance on my testimony. I actually worked at CDC, where I was responsible for public health practice and safety at all the Superfund sites in the country. So I know pretty much how it's done. If there were some unique things about New Mexico, they would focus on the government of New Mexico and the ability of your communication system to get information out in its way that's trusted. And I don't, somebody would need to do that. But if you went to your health agency and asked some of the policy people, they could design it for you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. So this question is more general. I don't know whether you can respond to that or whether guardians do have some response to that. The question is, as you prepare for, let's say, as you were preparing for this hearing, did Waddell guardians more or less talk to community members in the state of New Mexico, specifically within the basins where oil and gas operations, where we do have oil and gas operations? You know, I took notes of all the public comments that we received so far. You know, some of the committee members are from Santa Fe, talking about being exposed to PFAS in the water. You know, and in mind, I'm like, okay, is there any oil and gas in Santa Fe, right? So, do you have any, do you have any data, based on the communities more or less directly impacted by oil and gas operations in the state of New Mexico to back, let's say, some of the research that has been done in West Virginia and Pennsylvania to more or less support the case?
I heard it this morning. I have been listening to your people, and it's the same song in the new cafe. That's exactly what people were telling me in Pennsylvania. That's exactly people were coming to our offices and telling the very same kind of stories. They have limited water, they have limited resources to change it, but they're very concerned about the potential exposures. I don't think any of them that I heard this morning would want to repeat the experience that the people of Pennsylvania experienced. But I would be very surprised. The nature is the same in New Mexico as it is in Pennsylvania and in Connecticut and Maine and in various other countries around the world. There's air pathways that people are exposed to. We know that there's water pathways that people are exposed to. You people have very limited water. Just thinking about the amount of water that you would use to frack the wells is breathtaking, how much of your water supply you use. But I don't think, as a expert, which I am in this area, I would be able to go to any particular state and say, this is what this state ought to do or not do. I can give you the information, but that's up to you to decide how you want to deal with it.
Yeah, so Davis, can you respond to the other part of my question? Whether data were collected in these cities, counties?
Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so most of the testimony is all based on West Virginia, Pennsylvania, right? So are there any direct, let's say, data collected in the state of New Mexico?
Commissioner Mpoma, commissioners, I'll do my best to answer your question. And I think I would put it this way, and this really relates to the chart that people have been discussing, is that this chart, as I understand it from what Dr. Brown has said, is not used as a guideline in New Mexico. It is an example of the links that public health professionals had to go to try to solve a problem when they did not know what chemicals were present. And the reason they didn't know what chemicals were present was because Pennsylvania did not require full disclosure to the public. And Dr. Brown was a member of the public. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, so
if I could add just one thing. The data that I showed you is the data we had several as we went through this process. All the data that I'm showing you, if you look at some of the more recent papers, showed that we were pretty close to being on target. We had identified the same effects. Now there are papers that say, here's what the chemicals are. They've been analyzed by research studies, but we were not doing a research study. We were trying to respond to a public health outbreak, what we would call an outbreak. And we were gathering data on the fly and making decisions on the fly.
David, so my main concern here is that, while the guardians, you're asking a big ask of the commission. One is banning PFAS, and the other one is banning all undisclosed chemicals, right? So, as I sit here, I really want to see evidence of how let's say there's been numerous oil and gas operations in the state of New Mexico, right? So definitely, I want to see real data in our state. That should push us to more or less go the extreme of even banning undisclosed chemicals, where there is no data to support the claims.
Your experience with undisclosed chemicals will be, in my judgment, the same as the experience we had in Pennsylvania when we were working with undisclosed chemicals. Physicians and public health people simply cannot guess as to what the effects are. And you simply cannot assume the compounds are safe. We don't assume every compound is not safe, but when there are chemicals that are in the toxic category, which these are, we assume that we need to protect the public health.
Yeah, I do understand that. But as I sit here, I really want to see some work done in New Mexico, at least real evidence, data from New Mexico that can support the commission, for us to more or less go the extreme of even banning undisclosed chemicals. These are great examples, but what is happening in New Mexico? I want to see some real evidence based on, let's say, this week-long hearing. I want to see some community members in the direct oil and gas operations who are going through these problems. At least there has to be some kind of evidence, because you are more or less using West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And based on Jesse's comment, probably they are operating in the shallow zones in the state. So it's definitely different from the state of New Mexico. So I really want to see more information, based on any work study done in the state of New Mexico.
The Sierra Club did a study with the Navajos, which we worked with. I think the Navajo Nation is in New Mexico, and if you find that study, I'm sure that the wildlife guardians can find it for you and give it to you. You'll see the damage that we identified in New Mexico. So if you want data directly from New Mexico, it exists. You only have to go look for it.
And thank you, Commissioner Ampoma. Is there any reason at this time not to excuse Dr. Brown? No? Right. Thank you very much for your testimony, Dr. Brown.
Thank you for listening to me. And if you need any other thoughts, I'd be happy to share them with you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
All righty. So we've come to the vicinity of the end of the workday. Mr. Davis, I know you have two more witnesses, Dr. Spear and Ms. Troutman. What order do you suppose you'll be presenting them in?
I have not heard from Dr. Spear yet today, but he's supposed to be traveling. He may be en route. So if possible, I'd like to call Dr. Spear in the morning, assuming he gets here on time. And then we would call Ms. Troutman. If he does not get here on time, we will reverse that order.
All right. Thank you very much for that. We will start tomorrow morning at 8:30. I'll take public comment for at least a half hour for it to be given. And then we'll turn to the technical case whenever we run out of public commenters. Is there anything else we need to talk about before we break today? Sheila, would you confirm this room will be locked and we can leave non-valuable things overnight?
Yes, I will lock it up at the end of the day.
All right, thank you.
And we may have somebody on who's been waiting to make a public comment. I don't know if she's still here.
Oh,
Her
okay.
name was Ruth Striegel.
Okay, Ms. Striegel, are you still on the platform? I see an RS. No, that's Rebecca. Ms. Striegel, are you here? No?
Yeah, she may return tomorrow morning. I told her she could.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Sheila. All right, we will see you all tomorrow morning at 8:30. Sheila, no, no, sorry, Sheila, we did notice it up for 8:30. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, so we actually need to start then. Thank you.